All right, you know my name's obviously Bob. What's your name again?
Jamal.
Jamal. We've spoke before, I think. Yeah. Go on, you introduce yourself. I'll not guess.
Do you want me to introduce myself?
Yeah. Introduce yourself.
Ex-Muslim.
Yeah, I thought so. I just wasn't sure if I was remembering correctly.
It's got nothing to do with Islam. It's just
ex-Muslim Christian, right?
Christian.
Yeah. Thanks be to God.
The question here, there is a lot of people like we talk about atheist people, if you can say, deny, like they said, the Jewish story, the Old Testament is all myth and didn't happen, and just the Jews made up the story. I mean, Abraham, Moses, but the thing when we go with the history, Ptolemy one day asked what they call the translation of the 70.
Yes.
When he asked the Jews to translate the Old Testament,
which became the Septuagint,
from Hebrew or Aramaic to Greek.
Yeah.
And they did, So is that he was aware? He was aware of, and he definitely read when they translate. He knows many languages as well. Is that proof enough that this story happened? I mean, if it wasn't, if Hebrew at that time were lying and they translate,
I mean,
it doesn't make sense.
In terms of it being. So you're asking about Ptolemy's record of what he describes as his historical event. So the story has the hint of fable about it, and the thing that makes it have a hint of fable about it is like, it's got 70 translators, and each of the 70 went away into a separate cubicle, wrote down the Old Testament into Greek, and then came out, and they were all identical, right? That has the hint of a romanticized history. But there clearly was a move to translate the Old Testament Hebrew into Greek because of the Jewish Greek diaspora. So you had the Jews dispersed amongst the Greek-speaking world. They were raised in a Greek-speaking world, and their first language was Greek. And so that put pressure on and a need for a translation of the Old Testament into the Greek language. So would I die on a hill that said that Ptolemy's story is true? No. Do I believe that Ptolemy is probably picking up on an event that has some truth to it? I suspect so. Because to do translation work wasn't a cheap thing. So it was like, it was something that was usually done by people of means or people of power and influence and authority. So I suspect the story is probably rooted in a truth, but whether every incident of the story is true in exactly the way that it's been described, I wouldn't die on that hill. I wouldn't fight for that idea as like nothing of my faith rests upon it. But what we do know is that the Old Testament was translated in Greek, that the Jewish community was using a Greek translation of the Old Testament before Christ, at the time of Christ, and at the birth of the church. And when the apostles went out into the world to evangelize the world, and you had Peter and the other apostles going to the Jews, and you had Paul going to the Gentiles, the Old Testament that they were using was the Greek one, the Septuagint, right? And there was no agreed canon at the time of Jesus about what was the books of the Old Testament. There was agreement about some parts of it, but there wasn't agreement about everything. The church just adopted the Septuagint as it was, as they found it. And then the Jews later, around the year 100 AD, created a different canon, a Hebrew canon.
So 100, it's like something like 400 years later, or
No, 100 years,
AD.
100 AD,
Yeah.
the Jews kind of canonized what they thought was their Old Testament.
Okay.
But by that point, the church was born, and the church was using the Septuagint, and the Septuagint canon was different from the Hebrew canon that was decided later, about 100 years. Yeah? And you find that both these Old Testament canons exist within the church today. So Reformed Christians use the Hebrew canon as decided by the Jews 100 AD, and the church uses the Catholic churches tend to use the Septuagint canon. Does that answer your question? With a bit more besides?
That's okay.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks a lot.
Okay. And what was the reason for that question then?
I don't know, just heard the people denying all the story about the Jews and all the story about Moses never existed and Abraham.
Well, but the thing is,
so that's why I want to know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why he asked, I mean, if it was all lies or just they made up the story, how come one very important person at that time?
yeah.
And ask them to. That's the.
Yeah, I don't think this issue has any relevance to whether Moses really existed or not.
It just. Okay.
You know, in terms of like evidence for the Exodus is a highly highly controversial thing in academia, and the reason why it's a highly controversial thing in academia is because it happened so far in the past. It's very hard to find evidence for it.
The things were because a lot of that story happened in Egypt.
Yeah,
And Moses.
yeah,
And he was in Egypt, Ptolemy, and he was
Yeah.
in Alexandria at the time. The Jews as well, living
Yeah.
there. They were living there for a long time.
Yeah.
So he must be clicked something in his head. How come they talking about a very important person in Egypt? He was prince,
yeah.
and that they never existed before.
There is some evidence. There are some evidences that could be interpreted as evidence for Exodus. So, like, there's a papyrus. I forget the name of the papyrus. A papyrus is an ancient document.
I heard about that.
Yeah, there's a papyrus that talks about plagues striking Egypt, and you can read this Egyptian papyri
Oh, yeah.
that's talking about plagues striking Egypt, and even though it's not worded like the Bible, you can see how the Bible's plagues and the plagues that are described by the Egyptians can dovetail one another. So one of them is in this papyrus. It mentions that the water turned to blood. It mentions that there's nothing to drink. You know, if there's nothing to drink and the water has turned to blood, then yeah, that fits with the Exodus story. It says that there was a famine. Well, the Exodus story says that the locusts came and ate everything. It says that that slaves were weighed down by the wealth of their masters, and that was seen as a plague. And when the Israelites left Egypt, they took with them all the wealth of Egypt.
Because some of them, some historian Egyptian, very important person, denied there were slaves at that time in Egypt. So I said,
no, there was definitely slaves.
They say, yeah, there was no slaves. The Jews, they just made up the story. So there was no slave. The Egyptian never had slaves. The kings at that time never had slaves.
Yeah, but
now they had prisoners. So
well, the thing is, I find that highly unlikely because economies in that time and period were built on slavery. So it's more than likely that they did have slaves. I suspect that this historian probably doesn't know what he's talking about, or maybe
defend their ancestor because they're Egyptian.
But also, when they say at that time, that means that they're assuming that the time that they're talking about is when the Exodus event happened. The problem is we don't know exactly when the Exodus event happened. We don't know when the Exodus event happened. It's not like someone put down a calendar and wrote down the events of every single year. You know, it just didn't happen. And then also you've got to factor in things like the Bronze Age collapse. Now, my personal opinion is that the Exodus event happened in the Bronze Age collapse.
That's,
right? But the thing about the Bronze Age collapse is basically history just stops. You know, you get history going up to the Bronze Age collapse, then you get the Bronze Age collapse, and then there's just this gap where we're really struggling to piece together what happened, because something cataclysmic happened and a whole bunch of civilizations all collapsed at the same time.
They say there were people coming from the sea attacking Egypt.
Yeah, the sea people.
Sea people
Yeah.
attacking other.
Yeah.
I mean, other.
What would be interesting, and I haven't done this myself, because Exodus is not something I've managed to get my teeth into properly as a studier. But one of the things that would be interesting is to see when the papyrus date is of that papyrus that talks about the plague striking Egypt, and compare that to see whether that lines up with the idea of the Bronze Age collapse theory, which is my personal theory, and see if those two correlate. There's also a stalagmite or like an obelisk that seems to indicate this idea of slaves leaving Egypt, you know. So, yeah, I mean, the Exodus event is a tricky one from a historical point of view, because it happened so far in the past that history itself just hoovers up the evidence and destroys the evidence, you know. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, you know. And especially when we have sort of positive evidence in its favour. I personally think that the Exodus story is telling the story of the Jewish people from within the context of, peace be with you, brother, from within the...
with a signal, otherwise it will crash the signal.
Okay, but I've got my keys and cards and stuff in there, bro.
Put it in your pocket, just in
Well,
case.
could you not zip it onto here, or...
Just to-
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean, I'm sorry, bro, but...
better look. There you go.
Yeah. Oh, you could use this one. That's easier. Sorry, I don't have a coat with lots of tangles, I'm afraid.
Hello, sir.
Merry Christmas. He's a brother, a former Muslim. So the Exodus event is... what was I saying? Yeah. So I think that the Exodus event is told from the perspective of the Jewish people in Egypt. But I actually think they were already Hebrews inside of Palestine before the Exodus event, because the Egyptians ruled the Palestine area. And so if they were using slaves in Egypt, they would have used slaves in other parts of their empire as well. But the Exodus story tells the story from within Egypt and the story of the Egyptian Hebrews, you know. And that would line up with the evidence, because there is there's debate about whether there was already Jewish settlements or Hebrew settlements in the hills of Palestine before the Israelites entered. But that all begs questions around when it occurred. A lot of this hinges on when it occurred, and that throws your evidence out or in depending on when you say the Exodus event happened. And that's something that we don't have a fixed answer on. We have guesses, you know. And I'm in favour of a late Exodus event.
I heard I can't remember. He said probably during the time of Joseph.
Yeah.
Not all the Hebrews went to Egypt. Some of them stayed in Palestine.
Yeah.
So when Joseph asked his father to come with his brothers.
Yeah.
So probably some of them stayed in Palestine and not.
Well, yeah. I mean, Abraham, was it Jacob? No, Isaac. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Isaac and his brothers probably had households and probably had other family wider family inside of Egypt that didn't come into Egypt at the time that, you know, the Exodus, at the time that Isaac came in with his sons. So I suspect that's probably true, and that seems to
make sense, yeah, for me.
Yeah, because you got a wider family, you know, you got cousins and distant cousins, and they would have been connected to Isaac. So there you go.
Thanks a lot.
Anyway, no worries. Good to speak to you. Have a good day.